The Second World War was a war like no other, and yet it has come to define the very idea of war itself. The fighting stretched from the North Atlantic to the South Pacific, from the snowfields of Norway and Finland to the Libyan desert, from jungle fighting in Burma and on the islands and atolls of the Pacific Rim to SS-Einsatzgruppen in the borderlands and Gulag prisoners drafted into punishment battalions. For those involved in the fighting in one place, battles on the other side of the world could have been taking place on another planet. And when it came to the unspeakable cruelties of the Sino-Japanese War, they could have been taking place in the Dark Ages when marauding hordes terrorized peaceful populations into submission with conspicuous cruelty. In the Second World War, the character of a leader determined the course of events. More than any other war in history, the vast struggle was dominated in the age of totalitarianism by major figures. This establishes even more firmly in the popular imagination the idea of the great man theory of history. The paradoxes in our attitudes to the subject of the Second World War are striking. The conflict brought world history together for the very first time, partly because of its global reach, but also because it accelerated the end of colonialism in Africa, the Middle East, and South and East Asia. And yet, despite its overwhelmingly international character, every country involved created and then tended to cling to its own national narrative of the conflict. Many cannot agree when the Second World War began. Each country has its own historical version of events because experiences and memories of it are so different. For Americans, the war started in December 1941 with the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor and Hitler's declaration of war on the United States a few days later. Vladimir Putin, meanwhile, insists that it began only in June 1941, when Hitler invaded the Soviet Union. He angrily tries to whitewash Stalin's own invasion of Poland in September 1939 under the secret protocols of the Nazi-Soviet Pact. Most Europeans assume that the Second World War commenced with Hitler's assault on Poland. Yet for the Chinese, it began in 1937 with the Sino-Japanese War, or even earlier with the Japanese occupation of Manchuria. And many on the left in Spain are still convinced that it began in 1936 with General Franco's nationalist rising to overthrow the Spanish Republic. Some say this so-called long war of the 20th century lasted from 1914 to 1945. Others prolonged the period until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, seeing it as an international civil war more than a conventional state-on-state war. A number of historians extend the conflict even further, arguing over what is called the Long War of the 20th century. German historians were the first to define the First World War as the original catastrophe. This is true. Yet it was the Russian Civil War, with its unbelievable cruelty, destruction and famine, which set the pattern for the whole century. Its unprecedented horrors created a polarizing fear between whites and reds, then communists and fascists, leading to the Spanish Civil War and then to the Second World War. What we tend to forget is that the Second World War was a combination of many different conflicts. These were conditioned by big power rivalry, but also by bitter ethnic disputes following the collapse of four empires and the redrawing of frontiers in the Versailles Conference, as well as those elements of an international civil war from that polarizing clash between fascism and communism.